the Atlantic system is the West. This is why I say the West. This is why we should focus on the West. That trade between the American colonies, Latin America, Europe, and Africa, that was absolutely indispensable. Everything we think about, Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Political Revolution, would not have been possible without the Atlantic system. Now, that's important because what was the basis of the Atlantic system? It wasn't just commerce and industry. It was a particular kind of commerce and industry. At the time when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Europe was behind, one of the few places in the world that was emerging from a dark age. And in order to create this Atlantic system, which produced the wealth and the basis of the economy that we have today, the West, the European nations, had to literally hack, burn, and roast their way into progress. Columbus set off the largest genocide in human history. So in the Americas, we rarely talk about this, but they're up to, and I was actually surprised at the numbers when I was writing the book. The midpoint estimate of the amounts of deaths in the Americas after European contact is 68 million, I believe. And if you just look at what was then Hispaniola, the midpoint estimate, and so it could be higher, it could be lower, but the midpoint estimate of inhabitants of that island when Columbus landed was 8 million. By the time Columbus left in 1512, their midpoint estimate again is 100,000. And by 1542, there were only 200 natives left. In fact, up to 98, 99% of some of the native population are literally erased from the earth. But that was necessary. That was the clearing the way for this Atlantic system to come into being, right? That we can kind of imagine that, could it have happened another way? It happened this way. And this way meant that the Americas became the Garden of Eden for Europe. It became the place where Europeans of all hues, classes could go to make their wealth, etc. And that genocide is absolutely essential to allowing that to happen. The other really key building point of the Atlantic system, of course, is the slave trade. Slavery, again, utterly indispensable. Once the natives had been exhausted for their labor, Europeans needed to turn somewhere else. And where did they turn? They turned to Africa. And for 200 to 300 years, depending, took millions of young working age Africans, stole them from the continent. The lowest estimate is that 12 million people were forcibly transported from Africa to the Americas. The lowest estimate, again, is that double that number died either on the continent or in transit. So the minimum we're talking about is 36 million people taken out of Africa to fulfill this trade. And again, remember, what was the key commodities that built the West? Sugar and cotton, tobacco, all these things which were absolutely essential, right? So here you can see in the Americas, the building blocks of imperialism and also that wealth. Remember at the time before Columbus, the West was behind. It was the wealth from the Atlantic system that enabled the West to take over the rest of the world, to take over the East, etc. And from here, you can see a very clear logic of white supremacy, that Black and brown life is disposable in the pursuit of Western progress. It began in 1492, it becomes cemented in the centuries that follow, and then and it becomes even more cemented in the scholarship, in the work, in the Enlightenment, in Western European thought. It is not coincidental that it took a couple of hundred years after Columbus. I mean, the age of so-called reason is after the West has laid waste to large parts of the world, after the West has enslaved millions of people, after the West has taken over the world. And then you have these figures like Immanuel Kant, like Locke, like Rousseau, theorizing from a place of white supremacy, saying, look, this is how the world is. The white people must be superior because, look, we're superior. And this becomes the basis of our thought even today, unfortunately. This hierarchy where you have white on the top, Black on the bottom, and everywhere else in between. Moving to the present day, if you look at global inequality, it shouldn't surprise us to find that we've actually created the world in the image of white supremacy. The poorest part of the world is so-called sub-Saharan Africa. The richest parts of the world are the West, where white people live, right? There's a hierarchy in between of white supremacy. We have literally created the world in the image of white supremacy. And what happened and what changed is the old system, and this is why I call it the New Age, the old system of imperialism, European dominated, empires, large-scale violence, that couldn't hold forever. For one, there was resistance, there was revolts, there were rebellions. It was not possible to keep subjugating people in that manner. The second part, the empires collide, the empires collapse. What are the First World War in particular, the Second World War, but empires collapse, empires coming to a head, right? And the third thing that we see very clearly with the Nazis is the boomerang effect, what Amos Oz calls the boomerang effect, where racism, fascism, the logic of white supremacy comes into Europe and becomes enacted on white bodies, and everybody turns around and goes, wow, this was a really bad idea. So after the Second World War, that old system can't maintain. And what happens is there is a shift. There is a shift where it's no longer European empires that dominate. It is America that dominates. It's not a coincidence that the United States becomes a new seat. That was kind of always logical, given that the United States is just a more extreme version of Europe, a place where Europeans could act in ultimate barbarism to maximize their resources. We have a shift away from, not completely, but mostly away from the kind of violence that was associated with slavery in the imperial era. At this point, it's not necessary because you've already underdeveloped the world. You've already created the conditions where the West is on top. And so now we have financial.
There's no great time to do this.
Sorry.
I'm just going to do it now.
Okay, I dig it. I'm going to go.
Advanced technology has infiltrated this debate. You have a minute to summarize.
Okay, sorry. Okay, 1 minute. I'm going to go. Where was I? So this was the end anyway. So yeah, you have economic, World Bank, IMF, the UN even, in global imbalances in trade, etc. And so one stat I will end with here, which I think makes the point. 9 million people die every year through hunger. A child dies every 10 seconds because they don't have access to food. All of those children, almost all of them exclusively, are black and brown. The logic of empire is still very much with us. It is delivered in a different way, but the mechanism is still there. And it goes back to the very founding of what the West is. The West is white supremacy, and it cannot be anything else.
Thank you very much for coming there. I think goes absolutely on point and on the clock. Well, that makes really a very strong case there for Kehinde's argument, as laid out in The New Age of Empire, but delving back into the roots and where he sees that taking the world that we live in today and the arguments all around us. Jeremy Black, also historian, author of many books, including A Brief History of Slavery and the British Empire, History and a Debate, Inter alia. Jeremy, you have your 10 minutes beginning now on why the West is not fundamentally racist.
Well, could I take up some of Kehinde's points? And I want to look at some of them empirically, just items of fact, and some of them conceptually. And then, well, I'm always interested when historians disagree. I want to try and give some historiographical basis. So, it won't surprise people that I'm not of the same mind. For example, I don't see the demographics as being the same as Kehinde does. I would argue that most of the deaths in the Caribbean that occurred were a result of influenza and smallpox and not, as he calls it, genocide. That the very last thing that the Spaniards wanted to do was to have to buy a labor force in Africa and transport it across the Atlantic. And if you look at colonies like Peru or Mexico, there are relatively few African slaves because the majority of the population doesn't die in some kind of genocide and remains, as if Kehinde visits Latin America today, he will find that in much of Latin America, you can see very readily, and DNA work will also substantiate it, there are the descendants of those people who were there prior to the Spaniards. So I don't recognize the demography, and whilst I agree with him that roughly 11 to 12 million people were transported across the Atlantic, I think his figure that twice that number died in transit is just fanciful. It's not what the specialist literature on the subject argues. And again, I would be disinclined to agree with him about the salience of sugar and cotton. To me, the key commodities are coal and iron. And I read his book with some interest. I thought it's arguing a case very clearly, and he's cogent and fluent, but I think he's inclined to leave out what doesn't fit in. I mean, quite clearly there has been a lot of whatever we might refer to as racism in the history of the West. That is not the same thing as saying that the West is fundamentally about racism. And I think there is a slippage there in the analysis, which is problematic. Let's just put it like that. And again, for example, if you come to the Enlightenment, now as Kehinde will know, There is an enormous literature on the Enlightenment. It's been discussed in very many different ways. And as he eloquently argues, there is a new left critique of it, rather old left actually by now, but which presents it in the terms he does. Actually, ironically, if you think about this in 18th century terms, the whole point about the Enlightenment was that it was a movement of cultural relativism. The belief was, among Enlightenment figures, that far from Western society necessarily being the supreme example or acme of quality, there was this fascination with the Orient in particular, and there was also an interest, strong interest, in, as it were, new frontiers, particularly in the South Seas. So again, I would argue, and I don't think this would be much of a surprise to specialists on the Enlightenment, that in fact the Enlightenment is about cultural relativism far more than Kehinde portrays it as a matter of white supremacist. And, if you look, for example, at Gibbon's discussion of history, and as you may know, Gibbon's actually, his books go up to the mid-16th century, or if you look at William Robertson, or if you look at Adam Smith, I think all of their accounts of history rather exemplify this, as indeed does Voltaire. If you're looking at distinctive features of the West as an imperial system, I wouldn't say it's specifically or principally racist. I mean, I think that you would get whatever you might mean by racism or tribalism or whatever you mean by it. I think it's fairly continual and constant in world history. I think the major difference I would focus on for the West in, shall we say, the 16th, 17th or 18th centuries, as opposed to the other major area of the world which had, as it were, the economic and demographic weight to move towards great imperial strength, which is the various societies of East and South Asia. The principal difference is the West is very multipolar, doesn't in fact end up with one land power that is dominant, so that, you argue that gold and silver comes in from the New World and sort of powers everything. Actually, gold and silver helped to power Spanish strength, and obviously Spain failed to become the great power of the late 16th and early 17th century. It was defeated. Now, the contrast is more readily with China, which by 1800 has got about 300 million people. Europe about then is 60 million. And China, of course, is one state. And that is a very different nature. And I would argue that if you're looking at Western imperialism, the constant is this multipolarity. And it also means that Western powers have spent more of their time fighting each other than they've fought non-Westerners. And again, that doesn't really emerge adequately in Kehinde's book. So that if you wish to argue, as some people do, that Britain is a racist society, I personally think that's misleading. But if you wish to argue that, you have to really explain why the British devoted most of the last half millennium to fighting the Spaniards, the French, the Germans, and not pro rata elsewhere. So as I said, I think there is a level of complexity, and I'm rather, I'd like to think a four-dimensional historian with time as the fourth dimension, and I would argue that you need to have far more complexity than was offered by the very eloquence of our opening speaker. But the last point, on the present day, we will obviously have very differing accounts of what is going on at the present moment. But I noticed, and the comments about what is really horrible levels of poverty in parts of the third world, it is also worth bearing in mind that some former colonized areas or areas of imperial power, so let's say for Britain, parts of South and East Asia have done extremely well. Some former colonies, the Japanese colony of South Korea, for example, extremely successful. I don't think imperial rule itself explains why states cannot take off. And my last point, and this is looking at the world, I'm sure many of us are shocked at what's going on in Myanmar, Burma at the present moment. I personally am also being very shocked at the counts coming out of Ethiopia of the fighting there. I think we have to accept that just as there have been horrible things done by Western powers, so there have been horrible things done by non-Western powers. Virtue is not a monopoly of any one state. And I also feel that, as it were, banging on, I so happen to think Kehinde got it wrong, but you know, he'll have his point of view, banging on about the 16th century does not help us very much in discussing the iniquities, the inequalities, and the cruelty of the modern age. It doesn't help us even more if our accounts of the past are actively misleading, and if this actively misleading quality is then propagated in the modern world. Thank you very much.